Welcome to the Retail Tech Podcast. My name is Darius Vasefi, and today I have a special guest, Steve Dennis, founder and of Sagebury Consulting and a longtime expert and advisor in the retail space. Hi, Steve.
Hey Darius, how are you? Thanks for having me
I'm
on.
great. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Let's start with a brief background on
Sure.
yourself because I know it's pretty extensive.
Well, yeah, I'll try. It's been an interesting journey, I guess, but probably the highlights are, I mean, I have been in retail almost all of my career. I did work for a large consulting firm where I got out of when I got out of business school. I spent a few years in the CPG world, but really since the early 90s, so people can work out how old I am. Um, I've been in retail. I started my career way back when at Sears Roebuck and Company. Moved up to the senior executive leadership team there. Probably the most noteworthy thing was that I sometimes joke around that I was the world's first omni-channel executive, and I say that because in 1999 I led an effort around what we called multi-channel integration at that time. So it's part of the reason why I get very passionate about the need to integrate digital and physical channels because I've been worrying about that stuff for over 25 years. Then I moved down to Dallas, where I am now, to head up strategy for the Neiman Marcus Group. And then I also had some other responsibilities there, mostly around multi-channel marketing, customer analytics, data insights, those types of things. And then for quite a while now, I've been out on my own. As you mentioned, I founded Sagebury Consulting, which is an advisory firm primarily focused on broadly across all the retail brands, retail tech, et cetera. But really, for almost the last decade now, I guess I'm one of these, content creators or whatever, because I started a blog. I eventually started writing for Forbes. I've written a couple books now. Have my own podcast, which we've been doing for a little over 5 years. So I guess I'm a Renaissance man. It's probably the retail Renaissance man. How's that?
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoy listening to your podcast. I'll put a note for anybody that doesn't know, but great podcast. And what you talk about is really what is happening on the business side in retail
Hmm. Yeah,
on
primarily.
your
Yeah.
podcast. Okay, with your co-host Michael.
Yeah. Michael LeBlanc. Yeah. Who's
LeBlanc.
also, we've had actually fairly similar backgrounds. He's a Canadian, so he's much nicer than I am. But we both spent 2 decades or so on the operating side, and then have been out in the consulting, speaking, content creation world. So he's been a great partner. He also does all the heavy lifting, like the production and editing. So since
Okay,
I'm
okay.
not so good at that, so he does a great job.
Awesome. And then your books, definitely insightful, really useful, actionable information. And I want to go into the last one, which is, I think, called the Leader's Lead, correct?
Leaders Leap, yep, transforming your company at the speed of disruption, which is not just to manage people's expectations. It is not. My first book, Remarkable Retail, was very retail centric. Leaders Leap has some retail lessons in it, but it's much more broadly or much more general industry, more leadership book. I definitely leverage my experience in retail, use plenty of retail examples, but I wanted to try to do something that really kind of bridged the gap between why so many organizations, companies have difficulty transforming, and some ideas, hopefully useful ideas around what to do about it.
Okay. Yeah, what really stood out for me going through the book was really your focus on the mindset.
Hmm.
And I've also learned from my experience that if the mindset is not correct, nothing's going to work.
Hmm.
And if the
Yeah.
mindset is correct, you will find ways around obstacles.
Yes, I think that's definitely my experience. Just as kind of a little bit of a backdrop, uh, uh, there are plenty of good books, many of which I reference and used in putting Leaders Lead together, which really talk about the challenges of responding to disruption and innovation from a strategic perspective. So, all the way going back to Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, to some more recent books, Blue Ocean Strategy, Good to Great. These books are I would say, more academic in their approach, and they're more focused on the strategic elements. And I do touch on some of that, but to your point, I thought, well, it's not as if, and I can say this from my own direct personal experience, companies I've worked with, it's rarely the case that companies that are struggling don't know that they are struggling. And it's usually not the case that they don't understand some of the problems. So I'll just use a quick example from my Sears experience. I can tell you when I was the head of corporate strategy, which was way back in 2001 through 2003, we were very aware that we were losing market share. We had all sorts of customer data as to why some of our customers were buying their tools at Home Depot and Lowe's. And, you can kind of go through the litany of market share losses, why they were happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So knowing that you need to change is, of course, quite different than doing it. So what I wanted to understand more about is what is it that gets in the way beyond that strategic insight? And it did ladder back to what I eventually created as my 7 mindset shifts, or I call them mind leaps, to kind of line up with the book, that I think are really important if a leader, and this book is also very focused on the individual leader. I try to steer clear, partially because of my own perspective on it, but also partially because of my expertise. This isn't a book about change management per se or culture. I mean, there's lots of experts, there's lots of great stuff on that. I really wanted to try to get right in the face of leaders and what they need to shift in their thinking and their approach to be able to make the changes they must, not just see the changes they must. So I get into that a little bit.
Let's go through the 7 mind leaps,
Sure.
maybe.
Yeah. So so I spent a couple chapters just kind of setting up the problem, but yeah, the heart of the book is really these 7 mind leaps. And the first one, and these are, I wouldn't say strictly in order. It's not a sequence necessarily, though the first couple really are, I would say, foundational. And the first one is crush your ego. And what I think is, again, from my own experience and observing others, is as the pace of change, and I sometimes say this and I feel like it's really obvious, but the pace of change in retail, really since the mid 90s when the internet became a thing and e-commerce became a thing, has been, of course, very, very rapid. But we've gone pretty quickly through not only just the growth of e-commerce and its various flavors, more merchandise available, faster delivery, all the things that I'm sure everybody listening knows about, to smart devices, 5G, cloud computing, like now machine learning, generative AI, agentic commerce. So, it just is unrelenting, the pace of change. And what I argue, and I think most people seem to agree with, is that the pace of change is only accelerating. So the question is, are you as a leader willing to really take a look at how what got you here to your level of success may not serve you well in the future? In fact, not only may it not serve you well, it may actually get in the way. And so I go into, I'm not going to go through everything I get into in that chapter, because there is a chapter for each of the 7, but it's really to try to challenge people to see how humility and vulnerability can be really important, how unlearning, being able to rethink, get at your confirmation biases, a lot of these kinds of things are really helpful to be understanding how you need to change. And also, I think importantly, bring your organization with you, seek different kind of information, which is really tied to number 2, which somewhat, I don't know, confrontationally say, wake up. It actually had a slightly different title that was a little bit more profane, but my publisher convinced me to shorten it. Um, but some of this comes from my own experience, which is, and I think we see this all the time in retail. I'll just use one example quickly, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what this is about. But one of my favorite examples, because I worked in the department store sector as an executive leader for like 15 years. And certainly in Sears's case, when I joined, we were the number 2 biggest retailer on the planet. A few years earlier, Sears had been number 1. And we were just continuing to lose market share and relevancy. And as I said earlier, it's not like we didn't know this was going on. But to be able to wake up to the reality and stop being in denial and get a sense of urgency, I think number one requires you to really go deep on what is actually going on. But again, knowing something is not the same as doing it. But I think to radically accept the information and accept very, very firmly the need to change. But I also think, and there's plenty of examples of this, and it's kind of a classic strategy problem. I don't know if you were taught this years ago or probably have heard some version of this over the years. What business are you in? And so many brands and retailers lose sight of really the customer problem or the customer benefit they're trying to deliver. They're so hung up on the way they happen to deliver it. So if you look at department stores have hemorrhaged market share for 20 to 25 years. And a lot of that market share, I mean, people like to say it goes to Amazon. That is not so much the case. I mean, it is more recently, but if you look at the early days of market share loss, department stores were losing the beauty business to Ulta and Sephora. They were losing apparel and home business to TJ Maxx and Ross stores. I mean, this market share was being hemorrhaged, but those were different business models. And I think you have to be able to open the aperture to say, okay, where is my business model actually going extinct? And do I need a really different way rather than just thinking, as we did at Sears, frankly, for a number of years? Well, if we just improve our customer service, or we just improve our marketing, or we just carry a few different products, somehow that's going to get all this market share back from Home Depot, from Best Buy, et cetera. And so this wake up is both being able to see more expansively about the possibilities. It's gathering different sorts of information, but it is often really about that marriage between ego and information to really accept the reality of what you have to deal with.
So I think Sears is a really good case study. Now, what would you have done, hindsight, uh,
Yeah.
in 2001 to 2003 that you think would have changed the path of Sears?
Sure. So I actually think, and I've actually written something on this a number of years ago. I think it was pretty much game over already at that point, because what Sears needed to do, and it gets a little bit to what I was just saying. I mean, Sears was never, say never, but it is extremely difficult for Sears to have been successful in the apparel business. We were just and also ran in that business. We were very far behind a lot of terrific competitors, and even before the age of e-commerce. And actually, Sears had a very successful e-commerce business that time. In fact, we were bigger. I mean, people, just as a quick aside, people often say to me, "Oh, Sears could have been Amazon." And I said, "Well, in theory, that's true. But remember, at the time that it mattered, Amazon was only selling books and CDs. Amazon was losing a tremendous amount of money. In fact, a lot of people thought Amazon wasn't even going to make it. And so, it's easy now to say, well, they became the everything store. Sears had a history in the catalog business, et cetera. I said, but first of all, it's a huge leap to think that anybody back then would have seen that and offered that up as an alternative, because we had a bigger e-commerce business than Amazon did at the time, and we were on a good trajectory. So that was not like we had a failing e-commerce business and weren't going after it. But there's also just the practicalities of the capital it would have taken to build that out. And so anyway, that's an interesting story. But the core of Sears business was really in its hard lines, its appliances, its home improvement tools business. And what became very clear by the mid 90s was that was massively shifting the tool part of it and related things, home improvement. That was shifting to a better business model, Home Depot and Lowe's. And the appliance and electronics, consumer electronics business was moving to Circuit City, Best Buy, and a bunch of others. So we were never going to capture the value that was migrating through our mall stores. It was just an impossibility. So, and the reason why I say it was game over is we should have either started our own home improvement warehouse or off the mall home thing, or acquired Home Depot and Lowe's. And by the time we figured that out, because I actually worked on that two different times, and there was a group that worked on it before I was there, um, we could not afford to buy them. So it was just an impossibility. So the way so that's kind of a history lesson. The way I think about it today, and I'm working on some other stuff that's not really exactly in this book is if you have, and not everybody does, but if you have a business model that is approaching its expiration date, so to speak, you're only going to be able to do so much to fix a fundamentally broken business model. That was the thing at Sears. We held on for way too long trying to fix a business model that was expiring. It's like trying to make a better blockbuster when you're competing against Netflix, right? It's just the world has changed. The New York Times is not going to be able to, no matter how well they run it, they're not going to capture the most of the value in the media business. So I think what you have to do, and it's hard to see early on, and I can give you a couple examples of people who've done it in retail, but I call it like Earth One and Earth Two. If Earth One is becoming increasingly, uninhabitable, or you can see that it's coming, then you've got to develop something else in parallel. And so you have to start early. You have to test things. It's going to take you a while to do it. But the reason why I'm so negative on the department store business is it's been contracting for 20 or 25 years. Nobody's performing particularly well. Everybody's continuing to lose relative market share, and they don't have another place to depart to. They're just going to slowly die, not to get too negative about it, on this planet that is inhospitable. So, just a quick example, if you look at, and they've got some other issues which aren't strategic so much, but if you look at the brand that was formerly known as Restoration Hardware, people that are closer to my age will remember that Restoration Hardware used to be these little stores with just sort of a bunch of tchotchkes, and then they eventually like started to have some other kitchen stuff. But today, they are almost entirely these RH gallery stores. So, yeah, through all sorts of different reasons, I don't know all the story, but they decided they were never going to be able to make this old model particularly profitable in a growth vehicle. So they started to develop a somewhat related but pretty different version of that in parallel. I think we're seeing this to a lesser degree in terms of it being extreme with Dick's Sporting Goods. Dick's Sporting Goods has the House of Sport, which is not terribly different than their base model, but is twice the size, has some different elements, and they've been developing these in parallel. So I think you have to ask yourself the question: do I really have is my strategy broken? Is my business model broken? Do I need something fundamentally different or not? Not everybody does. I mean, there are plenty of businesses that have executional issues and there are things they can do more incrementally. But part of the reason why I call the book Leaders Leap is in so many cases when customers demand higher customer value and the pace of change is so great, you're going to have to leap ahead as opposed to try to get there incrementally. And there's just tons of examples at companies that have been trying for years and years and years to fix things through incremental improvement and without this Earth 2 to jump to. So anyway, that's a long answer, but I think, in Sears' case for sure, there needed to be a really different business model. We in retrospect could have developed a plan probably starting in the late 80s, early 90s to migrate the business over a period of time in the way that RH is doing it, in the way that Dick's Sporting Goods is doing. But there are not that many companies, that really, there's not a lot of success in retail companies. I mean, we can point to way, way more examples of companies that failed to respond and are either gone, Blockbuster, Borders, Bed Bath and Beyond, basically, Toys R Us is a much smaller company. The whole office supply business is, much, much smaller because they didn't respond to these changes. So sorry for the long answer. Hopefully that
No,
makes some sense.
this is really I think important, and I think it gets to your point about mindset. So like
Mhm,
when you look at all these different companies and how they survive and how they haven't survived, it's really the mindset of the leadership
mhm.
that got them through that. And just to clarify, when we talk about leadership, um, there is like a whole group in these large companies that are considered leadership. It's not just one
Right.
person. So where is
Yeah.
where is the breaking point? Where is the chain breaking?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So I would say this book is more oriented, but not exclusively oriented to the very top, the C-suite, the board, because as it relates to strategy and needing to drive, I mean, even though I said I wasn't trying to do a book about culture, I mean, ultimately a lot of this ladders back to culture. So for better or worse, at most organizations which have a more top-down structure, if it's not coming from the top, so for example, if you look at Walmart, which has been so incredibly successful over the last 7 or 8 years, they haven't radically changed their business model. It's been much more of a rapid evolution, but it's absolutely very much. And I've worked a little bit with Walmart, so I say this from some firsthand experience, but I can't take any credit for this in particular. But McMillan's leadership there has made a huge amount of difference. And if you, in my experience, as a C-suite leader, you have to build your team, and sometimes you got to get people on the bus or off the bus, just to go back to another kind of classic book, that aren't aligned with your vision. But if you look at what, for example, Gary Friedman's done at RH, that is very much his vision. He's had to bring people along, obviously, including his board and the rest of his management. Dick's Sporting Goods, um, their leadership clearly has been aligned against that vision. So I would say, it's mostly about the top team. But I will say, I hope at least, and I've gotten some feedback that as you go through the organization, VP, director, project leaders, some of these elements can be very, very helpful in your particular work. If you're a director of product development or something, you're not going to be able to change the whole culture around you. So when I talk later on in the book about a culture of experimentation, um, you may not be able to get supported in your desire to do that if that's not what the culture supports and budget support. And but I do think a lot of these mindset shifts are applicable to many people. As it gets more specific to strategy and sort of the big picture resource control, then it starts to tilt more very much towards the top team.
Uh, an interesting point that I see is the actual leadership, the C level, or the founding uh, part of the company, where a lot of these companies that you're mentioning that are doing good actually are still being run by the founding founders or the founding families.
Yeah, I think I haven't done an exhaustive study of this, but I think it's a pretty mixed bag. I mean, I've worked with a couple companies that are founder led or family driven. And, typically because they are so associated with the brand and the company itself, a lot more can get done. But I often see that it's hard for them to let go, um, because what made them successful is not necessarily what's going to make them successful going forward. So that's where I think it goes back to the first couple of things we talked about, is just being able to look at things differently and not assume, it's a cliche to say when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But that is a real problem. I like to, in the book, I quote Liam Neeson's character in Taken, I think it is, which have a very particular set of skills. And there's a lot of, I mean, I'm guilty of this as well, of saying, well, I think I'm pretty good at X, Y, and Z, and I lean towards that approach, but that doesn't work for sure in lots of circumstances. And I've learned the hard way sometimes, and I've seen clients and others. So I think it's a mixed bag. Sometimes you need an outsider to come in who's not saddled by that baggage or groupthink. So I don't know that I can make a blanket statement, but for sure, the brands that and organizations that really, like, I can tell you from working with Walmart, they are very, as much as they've been open to do a lot of things differently, they're also incredibly clear about who their customers are and how they deliver value. And they don't let themselves get too distracted by bright, shiny objects, though there was a time a few years ago when they did a little bit. But the great thing there is they admitted their failure. And one of the things I talk later in the book about is, I don't really like this never give up sort of culture. I think it's important to be resilient, but quitting is one of the best things you can do. And I think you see some very good companies, Walmart being among them, that know when to quit. I was just out at Amazon, and that's very much about, that's a very big part of their culture, is a lot of experimentation. You could argue they've stuck with some things past their youth, their useful life, but there's also plenty of things that they did, it didn't work, and they moved on or took lessons from that and reshaped it. So that discipline of not getting too caught up in your past success, being able to admit when you're wrong and move on, I think is really important if you're doing any kind of innovation work. But I would argue, and it's a big premise of the book, is a lot of stuff that I talk about it's not necessarily totally new ideas, but in a lot of cases it's, I mean, hopefully I put it together in an interesting way, in a new way, but a lot of it is, well, to the extent that experimentation was important. I mean, I've been talking about experimentation for 30 years. I didn't make that up. It's not a new idea. But when the world is moving so quickly, and when it's very unclear often, you just think about AI models. Anybody's following that, right? It's like, oh my God, Google's going to be in trouble. It's all about open AI. Well, depending upon when people listen to this, like the narrative's changed a little bit. Like open AI is looking a little bit weaker, and Gemini and Sora and things that are coming out of Google look pretty amazing. But I don't know, 3 weeks from now, there'll be some new thing. So, I mean, it's very hard to place your bets and with a high degree of confidence because of the pace of innovation. And so that means you have to build agility into the way you do things, but it also means you have to be pretty humble and develop a different set of skills. So a lot of the things that we've been talking about for 10, 15, 20 years are still important. It's just in many cases, they're way more important to be good at than they might have been. I mean, even just quickly on the Sears example, which again is probably pretty obvious to everybody. Back in the 90s when I first got into retail is 98+% physical stores. And so, even though Sears did not ultimately respond very well to the growth of Home Depot and Lowe's, just to pick them, you know, we could tell, like, it takes a long time to go from just being in the Southeast to the entire United States, right? So, I mean, it took them 10, 15 years to build out a national network, as opposed to something like, Temu, uh, or any kind of digital only model, which can go from nothing to, in Temu's case, tens of billions of dollars in 2 or 3 years. So again, kind of obvious, but it doesn't seem like a lot of leadership teams have really, it's obvious, but and I don't say this in the book, but I've been saying this in some talks I've been given over the last year or so. I keep asking the question, we all agree that the world is changing, has changed incredibly and is changing very quickly. But if the world has changed so much, why have so many companies not changed very much? Like everybody agrees this is
Mhm.
happening. But when I look at like, well, okay, what have you done? If I'm in a particular company, tell me about how you changed to keep pace with that. And most times, people start looking at their shoes because they know they haven't. And so now that again, that doesn't make it easy to do. So part of what I try to do in the book is give a little bit of advice on how to do it, because it isn't easy, and there's plenty of examples of companies that have gotten in trouble because they couldn't do it, and it's not because the people are hopelessly incompetent or stupid or mean or it's not bad. They're not bad people, but nevertheless, the outcomes are often quite devastating, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the ego part definitely is definite. I mean, is a key issue, and something else that I've also experienced myself is in a lot of companies, the mindset of the teams, employees, maybe even all the way up, is I'm sure I didn't come up with this myself, but like what I call is me first instead of we
Mhm.
first.
Right. Yes.
So when we were in meetings proposing something new, the first thing that I could see in people's minds is how's this going to affect my job? How's this going to
Right.
affect my team? And
Yes.
then how is this going to affect the company?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's been my experience as well. Maybe you talk about a couple of the other ones because I think we're getting around the
Yeah.
edges of this a little bit, and it ladders back to a couple of the companies I mentioned. So I'll talk about 3 and 4 kind of together. So the titles, chapter 3 is special, not big, and then start with wow. And the way I've, in retrospect, perhaps could have done a better job in the book explaining this is, so many, particularly if you go back, people that have been around retail for a while will remember the era of the category killer, where there were all these companies, Home Depot and Lowe's, we talked about, but you can go across every major category in retail, and there were one, two, three, four companies that had a similar business model. So, office supplies with Staples, Office Max, Office Depot, where it was, we're going to take the subset, but huge subset of retail, and we're going to have a little bit of everything for just about everybody. And, these are the kind of like the peak of the bell curve sort of models. Like, you're cutting some things out, but you're really trying to cover almost, the largest addressable market. That was a really, really successful strategy. And I'm sure if people just go through the list of different category killers, Borders, Barnes and Noble, like there are a ton of really iconic names, uh, most of which are either gone or smaller because the internet and the long tail, endless aisle, whatever you want to call it, basically solved the issue of having everything available. It wasn't nearly as interesting to have to go to a place to see everything. In fact, you could see more, get more on the internet. So, of course, nothing prevented any of those category killers from having a great e-commerce assortment. But as we've learned, Amazon and Walmart and a few others, Costco, have been able to build out this unbelievable fulfillment structure and have this massive scale, not only in physical distribution, but technology. And so the world is really bifurcated. So the middle, this a little bit of everything for everybody, it's very, very hard to be successful at that anymore. And this has been a huge shift over the last 20 years. And now you have these super scale companies, which command a tremendous amount of market share. They're actually growing disproportionate to their current market share. So Amazon, Costco, and Walmart are capturing about 50%, over 50% of incremental spending in all of retail. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have what I call special, not big. Not that they're tiny, but they're really specialty retailers that have said, we're not going for the peak of the bell curve. We're going for a very particular set of customers, and then we're going deep, and we're amplifying the wow. So really, these two chapters together are to say, first of all, if you're not Amazon, Walmart, Costco, a few others, you are not going to be able to out Amazon, out Walmart. Like they are so much bigger. And so if you are much tinier, don't have those kind of resources, you want to get out of the middle because the middle is collapsing, and you want to narrow your customer focus and become more important to a narrower set of customers. And that is by delivering amplified value. And the amplified value might be really unique product. It could be really great service. It could be a great environment, but something special that makes you more important to a smaller group of people. So that this is one place where I do get more into strategy, because I think this is a very fundamental change in the basis of competition in retail that has emerged over an extended period of time. And this is not new. I was talking about this in my first book. And even before I wrote my first book, I was talking about this. But again, it's become even more extreme and more important to say, so if you're Macy's, you're going to fix yourself, you have to execute better, but you also have to narrow your focus and become more important, because people aren't going to switch back from TJ Maxx if you're just slightly better on some dimension, because you're losing on convenience, and you're probably never going to have the price point that they do because of their sourcing structure and what their customers expect. So anyway, those are things. And then the last three are really more about how to go about this. And and we touched on this a little bit, but chapter 5, the mind leap, is think radically, and this gets a little bit to um, really coming at it. Again, this is kind of a cliche, but what what problem are you trying to solve for the customer, and then work backwards, as opposed to the tendency to start with what you have and try to make it a little bit better. So again, like going back to the example of Blockbuster and Netflix, well, what the customer wants is access to the entertainment options in a convenient way. uh, and so Blockbuster, by being a place where you have to go to get physical video, is not going to be able to compete effectively in their current business model with a streaming service, right? It's just a fundamentally different way of doing things. And so, now also we are seeing retailers, Amazon and Walmart, great examples, Kroger, that are making a lot of money outside of the traditional first party sale of product. So marketplaces, advertising, retail media networks, subscriptions, membership, other ancillary revenues, and that's a very different way of looking at things. So I think in some cases, it's kind of the creative destruction piece of this as well.
Mhm.
Technology is changing, new competition, consumer expectations, brands, discovered on TikTok is becoming hugely important, didn't even exist a few years ago. Whereas before, how did you discover new products? You usually went into a store and ran into it, or maybe you saw, read a newspaper article or a magazine feature or something like that, right? The media landscape is different. And so the customer journey is different. So you've got to be able to kind of disaggregate and let go of what you have. So one specific example, and I'll just use the RH example. RH did, even though their gallery stores are really, really different than the format that was their core format 15 years ago, they did bring in some assets that they had to it. They used their name, but they changed it a bit, from Restoration Hardware to RH. But they had product sourcing capabilities. They had, a lot of infrastructure and technology that they could bring into these new stores over a period of time. So, part of this exercise that I call kind of a blank sheet strategy, blank canvas strategy, is to say, well, if what we want to be is the number one, for this set of customers, we want to be their preferred choice for X, Y, and Z. Well, you know, let yourself, free yourself of some of the constraints, at least initially, to think about what that could look like. And then if you happen to have great assets, brands, whatever that might be, you can bring into it. That's great. And that's what I think we see with RH and some others. But the reality is a lot of the innovation is coming from outside the industry. Warby Parker innovated in the eyewear business from not being in the eyewear business at all and leaning into venture capital to get there, whereas they're the two big eyewear companies in the US have not done anything really to respond to that. So there are some real differences in terms of what you get support for from the financial community. It's a huge advantage for a lot of these new disruptors to be able to come in and pick new locations rather than, the leases they've been stuck with for a long time. They're, from a retail technology standpoint, it's great. They get the latest and greatest
Yeah.
available and then build out a new architecture. Whereas, I'm sure many people listening, I mean, the number of times both at Sears and Neiman's and at some of my consulting clients, it's like, yeah, we know where we want to get to, but we've got we've got this old technology. We don't have to replace all point of sale or move from, move to the cloud. And, so anyway, there's lots of constraints that I don't want to trivialize because those are real things people have to deal with. And in many cases, it's the outside players that have a certain amount of advantage to disrupt.
Yeah, so I mean that level of experimentation is key, and also like designing experiments is an art.
Hmm. Yes.
You need to, what I always tell ourselves is we need to design the smallest experiment that is going
Hmm.
to give us the data that we can use to do the
Yeah,
next experiment.
absolutely. Yeah, I think, and the other thing that I've learned is, I mean, not only does practice matter, right? Like, I mean, we look at, so many things that I'm aware of or have been involved with, where you start may look, quite a bit different than where you end up. And so I think, I've seen a lot of companies, particularly legacy companies, that spend a lot of time agonizing over starting, you know,
Hmm.
uh, and or put all their eggs into one basket. I worked on one project many years ago where it was kind of the first breakout move from not a company that had not done a lot of experimentation. It was a new retail concept. And I remember the CEO saying, we can't screw this up. This has to work. And I remember saying, like, well, if that's our standard, there's no way I can tell you that. One of the, I think, I know I've included this, I think it's in Leaders Leap. My friend Seth Godin says, if failure is not an option, then neither is success. But that is very much not part of many companies. So you have to both be willing to find that sort of minimally viable project to get going. You have to be willing to iterate quickly. And I think in a lot of cases, depending upon what it is, like, just going back to the RH example, I don't really know. I mean, they tested very small elements of it along the way, but at a certain point, you got to build this palace, right? Like it's the first big step on it. That
Hmm.
was expensive
Yeah.
and that was very risky. That's not what most companies are dealing with in terms of experimentation, right? But I do think a portfolio approach can be very helpful as well, right? So you may want to be trying a bunch of different things simultaneously because you don't know which approach is going to work. But yeah, if you can keep it small, iterate through it quickly, be willing to kill it if it's not working or shift it, take your learnings and move on. So I think, when you look at companies, I always say like there's no magical formula to innovation. Um, but you can look at the companies that are successfully, that constantly come out with new innovations, whether Amazon, Google, we can go through like lots of companies that just are Walmart that are just constantly doing new things. Well, they try a lot of stuff. They fail at a pretty high rate. But net, it's worked for them. And so I don't think there's a magic formula, but I think you can look at some things that give you a much better chance for success. And you never want to get to the point where it's kind of a Hail Mary, as well as like, okay, well, now we don't know what to do. Let's just take all of our money and go to Las Vegas and put in one number and hope it works out.
No, that I mean that it is a real skill actually on how to design good experiments.
Hmm.
That should
Yeah.
be something that we need to get educated on. I don't see
Hmm.
any kind of like really formalized education on how experimentation, building your experimentation muscles almost, and the
Yeah.
culture of experimentation that needs to be like the whole organization needs to know that they are expected to experiment
Right.
small, and if they it's not a failure if it doesn't provide the assumptions and the hypotheses. It's a lesson.
100%. Absolutely. And the few companies that I've spent time with that are very good at this, they talk about it in much the way you describe it. You don't even hear them typically say failures. They'll say lessons or experiences or
Mhm.
whatever, because I think they don't want to get to suggest that somehow it's wrong. It's actually desirable. And Jeff Bezos used to, you may know this, that Jeff Bezos in his annual CEO letter or whatever that's called, when he would go through the list of accomplishments, he would list the number of failed experiments as an accomplishment. And I think that's a really interesting way to look
Yeah,
at it because if you're not trying stuff, you're not likely moving ahead. I would just be lucky, really. I mean, no company's that good that they're going to get everything right. And it probably means if you're not getting a lot of innovation, you're probably being way too conservative. But you have to get the right place. It's not about just wildly trying stuff and hoping it works out. That's not it at
that's the
all.
skill. That's the art
Yeah.
and the skill of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I guess the other thing I'd add to it, which is kind of what you were saying, I think, what I've seen with a lot of companies, mostly retail companies, is, retailers will have lots of functions, risk or loss prevention, merchandising, allocation, planning and allocation. Like, there'd be all this structure to it, but somehow, innovation is often not seen as a serious discipline worthy of the degree of funding and expertise that is necessary. I heard one CEO that I work with say, well, innovation is everybody's job. And I'm like, well, that's a cool thing to say, but that's not a process. And that's not, if everybody has to beg, which I have done in a couple of jobs for some money to experiment, chances are you're not going to do much experimentation, so there's lots of, and I get into some of them, not all of them, there's lots of good ways to improve the quality of innovation effort. The last one I just wanted to touch on briefly, mind leap number 7. I sort of cheekily say faster, faster, go, go, go. But and I want to be a little bit provocative with the titles on some of these things, but speed is just so important. The subtitle of the book, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, kind of begs the question, well, what do I mean by the speed of disruption? And, my answer is, and this is never a very compelling answer, is, well, it depends. Because it depends very much on your particular situation. If you're developing agentic commerce models, I imagine it's pretty darn fast. If you're, I don't know why I pick on my dry cleaner, but I don't think the dry cleaning business is, there's probably some robots that are going to come in or whatever, but you know, it's not super complicated what makes for a good dry cleaner, everybody's kind of the same. And I go to this dry cleaner, they're perfectly nice, but it's mainly because it's right very close to me, right? That's kind of the key
Hmm.
thing. So you're going to be on a spectrum of how much customers are demanding higher value. So I think of this very, very visually, that amplify the wow, like how much customer value, how much better do you have to be than your next best competitor or wherever your competition is moving? That's the height of it. But then you also have to pay attention to the velocity. And if if greater and greater value is being delivered in the market and disruption is happening very quickly, you're going to create this gap between that the gap is caused both by the height as well as the y and the x axis, right? That's what creates this great gap. So it's going to be very unique to each organization's particular situation. But the key thing is to understand it and accept the reality. So, if you're, and I use this example, just we talk about this on the podcast a lot, if we look at results. Well, if the apparel market, you're in the apparel business and you have a pretty wide audience, as say department stores do. If the apparel business is growing at say 5%, and the best players like TJ Maxx or Abercrombie and Fitch are growing 7 or 8 or 9%, and you're growing 2%, that's positive. That's better, but it's not good. You are still falling further and further behind. If somebody's going 60 miles an hour and you're going 20 miles an hour, and now you're going 30, in some sense, that's an improvement. But you're getting further, as time goes on,
Yeah.
you're getting further and further behind. That's the thing to pay attention to. So if you're not honest about it and understanding why that's happening, and again, it'll be different in some cases, it may be we just don't know enough to bring the products to market that would make a difference. It may be we know what to bring to the market, but we don't have the talent. And maybe you need an acquisition or maybe you need to hire, so I can't, retail by itself, but also every part of business, as I said, is not a retail specific book. I can't specifically say, well, here's the exact roadmap, for every single situation. So your mileage may vary. You have to really dissect this. But if you're not paying attention to both the amplification of value and the speed at which it's occurring, you're not going to have a good plan to attack it. And so, yeah, so I try to, really
Yeah.
just end by, and again, not everybody needs to take a massive leap. It may be a series of small jumps that are fine, right? So not everybody is in this situation where they have to blow everything up and just suddenly do everything differently. Like I don't think many companies have that situation. And probably if you do, it's too late. I have, in some cases, because
Yeah.
it's too hard to catch up when you're that far behind, which is really what caused me to leave Sears. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think you can see lots of companies, lots of leaders that are doing this well. Unfortunately, you see lots of companies that continue to struggle. And, if you don't change the direction, you're probably not going to end like where you end up.
Great. Well, that's a really good set of skills and things that people really need to pay attention to survive. Like
Mhm.
a lot of these things are not optional anymore. Like you
They're
either
not, right?
change or you're not going to survive.
For sure. And, to frame it a little bit more positively, I do think that there are companies that they may be doing perfectly fine. Um, but you have to stay on top of these kinds of things because, it is easier and easier to get blindsided in some cases. Like I said earlier, back in the day when it was all physical retail, you had plenty of time to respond. But to the degree that the culture shifts very quickly because of social media or just the technology gets deployed much more quickly because of cloud computing and so many things being digitally driven. I mean, it's just a different world. So even if you are doing well, um, I think one of the quotes I have in the book is from Len Goodman, who says it's never too early to panic. And I do think some companies stay paranoid. Some of the best companies are like, okay, just because we're killing it right now doesn't necessarily mean we will. So there's both the we're behind and you better catch up, and there's the we're ahead or right there in the middle of the pack, but you've got to keep
Yeah.
pushing pushing around the edges. And so, yeah, that may not take a leap. That may just take aggressive progress, staying on offense. So, again, everybody will be in a somewhat different situation. But the more you understand the reality of the situation, the more you understand how different things are today than they were even 3, 4, or 5 years ago, and how different they are. I mean, I'm willing to bet that uh, there will be more disruptive change in the next 5 years than there was in the previous 5 years. And that's only because that's happened every year, probably since the beginning of time. But this
Yeah,
exponential change versus linear change, it's sometimes hard for us as human beings to get our head around what that really means. But you can just
it
look at
is.
what's happening to see how easy it is to get yourself into trouble and how easy it is to grab a lot of market share if you really do this well.
Yeah. So let's close on I want to ask your opinion and you can give me quick
Sure.
thoughts about some of the things that have been happening. Of course, we didn't talk too much about AI, generative AI, the big
Hmm.
gorilla in the room right
Yeah,
now,
right.
but these are related to that. So, Chat GPT shopping, what do you think about
Mhm.
that?
I'm pretty, I mean, I think there's still, as there often is with new technologies, a fair amount of hype. Uh, and I don't think it will transform all of shopping. But I think there are very clear benefits. I was, having worked at Neiman Marcus, the value that comes from a really good personal shopper, one on one. Not all of that, at least the way I can conceive of it anytime soon, is going to be replaced. People like human contact. There's different things, but for many people that couldn't access that level of personal shopping, I think an agentic, having an agent perform that for you, putting outfits together, planning a trip, it's already pretty powerful. So I'm quite optimistic. Well, I guess it depends on your point of view where you sit, but I believe that is going to be a pretty big game changer quite quickly.
Okay. Walmart working with ChatGPT.
Um, I think the main thing to me is that they are doing it. I don't have a firm opinion as to how significant it will turn out to be. I do think a lot of retailers should be worried about getting disintermediated, so to speak, where people can bypass um, a the intermediate distributor to go straight to the brand. And so I think that is a worry for any multi-brand, multi-line retailer. So I think but I don't know. I mean, I think I heard Doug McMillan talk about this. They are dipping their toes in the water with everything. So I don't think this is a vote on ChatGPT or a vote on the degree to which this is going to change their business, but I think they absolutely see it has the potential being quite transformative. And so I think aggressive experimentation is the way to go. But I think there's a lot that has to happen. I'm not worried about Walmart going out of business anytime soon if they don't do this.
Okay. What about Amazon blocking AI agents?
Well, I have a little bit, I don't think it's inside information, but having been with Amazon executives last week, my understanding, though they didn't say this exactly, is that they are appropriately concerned about managing the customer experience. And so I would say this is a broader comment, not necessarily specifically to Amazon. I'm not saying people should block or not block, but I think if it's very important to you to control the customer experience and make sure that bad information isn't flowing, that there's fraudulent product, these kinds of things, you should be careful about the quality control. So my interpretation is that they're not. Well, I don't think they're planning to block forever, but I don't. They didn't tell me that. Um, but I think it's the very, they always say they're customer obsessed, and I think they really do for the most part mean that. And I think they're just trying to work out the best way to do it would be my guess. Whereas obviously Walmart has taken a different approach. I'm not sure which one is right, but eventually you're going to have to play nice, most likely with all the agents, or at least the ones that come from reputable companies.
Okay. What about, I mean, yeah, I'm sure you've probably heard about grocery stores also working with ChatGPT and
Hmm.
agents and even Instacart.
Hmm. I don't know how this is all going to settle out. I think it's early days, and so experimenting with it. I mean, if in the marketing world, we used to talk about this, or at least some of us used to talk about it as the toll booth operators, right? So
Hmm.
if and that was more in the context of digital marketing, right? So if if Meta is influent, not if to the degree Meta is influencing where customers end up shopping, they're able to extract value from retailers to go through their toll gate. And it's good to be the toll booth operator in many cases rather than the retailer. And so I think here you've got, if customers, and increasingly are, starting their shopping journey at, in Chat GPT, Gemini, wherever it might be, Daydream, Perplexity, uh, you're going to have to figure out how to operate in that environment. So I think whether you're, doing delivery through Instacart or wherever, it's just people are injecting, or not people, these companies are injecting themselves at the top of the funnel, so to speak, in the customer journey, and you can't afford as a retailer to get shut out. So you're going to have to figure out how to do that. But how this will ultimately play out, to what degree. I mean, these Gen AI companies have to figure out how to make money too, and not all of it's going to be license fees, right? They're going to
Yeah,
presumably
yeah. I
be,
mean,
an
yeah,
advertising model, and then how many places, you can, Instacart's advertiser, Instacart's a service. Eventually the people that are doing the real work, which is, making the food or producing the product, are going to have to figure out how to stay in business, and not everybody can take a cut. So I'm not smart enough to predict how that's all going to uh,
too early to tell.
shake out, but ignore it at your own peril. I guess that would be my over, but
Yeah.
that I'm, not to tie it back to the book so much, but that is the wake up part of it, right? Like you have to open the aperture and really be into heavy learning mode, and not get too locked in into any particular way of seeing things. Like, there's plenty of people that have famously said really stupid things about the future, right? And they're also at the same time, Mark Andreessen, I pick on this too much, but Mark Andreessen 10 years ago or said, in the future, all shopping will be done online. Well, since he said that, physical retail has grown like 50%. So e-commerce is a greater percentage, but like we're nowhere close. In fact, we haven't moved any closer really to all retail being done online. So, people have these big hyperbolic statements often, like everything's changed. And a lot of times things do change quite dramatically. And a lot of times, we go back to kind of the same path we were. So I think when it's early days, new technologies coming out, there's so much experimentation. It's very hard to land on a particular outcome, but you better be in there understanding it and placing some bets. But to your point, they could be smaller bets um, until you learn, and then you decide whether you're going to step on the gas.
When one last thing is when I think about my own work in my own company, the what is becoming apparent is the value of our direct relationship with our customers,
Hmm.
getting to know them. And that's not just the getting to know them, but it's also like the massive amount of data that
For
we
sure.
actually can have ourselves. And I
Absolutely.
think that's going to be really the key with all of these like, partnerships that we just mentioned is the
Mhm.
question is, are you getting closer to your customers or are you
Right.
getting further away from them? What are your thoughts on
Yes.
the value of that?
Well, first of all, I think that's a very good way to think about it. There's been a lot of ink spilled on direct-to-consumer models versus wholesale models, those kinds of things. But I think that the advantage, which of course technology has enabled in a way that was pretty much impossible 25 years ago. I mean, I spent some time in the mail order catalog business where we did have much more data, but it was not particularly enabled by sexy technology. Today, the ability to collect all this data, make sense of it, and then go back to customers with an improved offering, whether that's marketing or product or whatever. I mean, it's just dramatic or dramatically different. So I think you need to ideally have that direct relationship with the end consumer and be able to leverage that data to your advantage. I think the thing, and this is not exactly your question, but what I think sometimes people get wrong is they don't necessarily understand the underlying economics of that and the advantages sometimes that come from having partners. So Nike has gotten a lot of criticism for going too fast on their direct to consumer strategy. I think that was fundamentally rooted in the right idea, which is, why rely on too many wholesale partners to control your brand, to have the data, to be have that relationship directly with the customer if you can shift it to your advantage. Some things went awry along the way, and that's a different podcast probably. But I think fundamentally, working to get closer to your customer is the place to be. Again, it depends on Amazon, Walmart, a few other retailers are getting close to their customer, literally by or somewhat literally, somewhat metaphorically, by being able to deliver product in 30 minutes. Um, so that gets to a customer benefit, but it also gets to, I'm more likely perhaps to choose you as my provider because you can shorten the distance between, what I want and my ability to get it. So I think it plays out in a lot of ways, but I think as a mindset, if we want to go back to that, getting closer to your customer is a really good mindset to have. You just need to be careful to not lose sight of where plenty of brands benefit from product brands have benefit from being the exposure they get in a department store or other kind of retailer or being in the marketplace. So it's not an all or nothing proposition in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and it ties directly to the concept of a moat or
Hmm.
defensibility for your business.
Sure.
What
Right.
is the moat for you? I mean, and again, like you made a good distinction between brands are different, retailers are different, shopping apps are different. Everybody needs to figure out their own moat.
Hmm.
And the moats are just like moving and changing so fast that I can't think of anything else that is more powerful than having the relationship with the customer.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I mean, I think that, if you had to pick one thing, that's the thing. Clearly people create, I mean, Amazon's built this amazing moat because of their fulfillment network and their marketplace relationships and all those kinds of things. Very difficult to replicate. Really, the only company that's getting close to that is Walmart. I mean, everybody else, like, good luck. I don't see like the amount of money
Hmm.
it would take to build that out now, I think is insurmountable. In some cases, the moat is the brand story. And I always say, people buy, having worked in luxury, people spend $2,000 for a handbag, not because it carries stuff any better than the public radio tote bag, right? It's the story you get to tell. Now, it's not to say that the quality and the craftsmanship are not important, but most of that extra value comes from. It's not exactly the relationship with the customer. It's really the customer's relationship with your brand as part of who they are or what they want to represent. So there's lots of different ways it can play out, but the important thing is to really be clear on what it is you're trying to do. When you get wishy-washy about it, or you try to be a little bit of this, a little bit of that, usually there's somebody else or a set of somebody else's that are doing what you're trying to do that much better. And if it's just table stakes, that's fine. But if it's the basis for competition and you can't figure out how to do it, then it's very easy for you to just get obliterated. And it's a very negative way to talk about it, but unfortunately, it happens much faster and oftentimes much more harshly than it ever has.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and hearing your thoughts.
Thanks. Well, I hope it made a certain amount of sense, but I appreciate the
Absolutely.
opportunity.
Are you working on another book, by the way?
I'm not going to break any news here. I am not actively working on another book. I just launched recently my Substack, and that's where I'm channeling some of my newer ideas. Whether a book will emerge spontaneously from that or not, we shall see. But I have no immediate plans. But I'm sort of like a politician. Like right now, I'm not running for governor, but
Okay.
reserve the right to
Awesome.
change my mind.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Darius.